We are in our second session in church history. If you're joining us by way of YouTube later on, welcome. We are glad you're watching. Today, we are going to get started with just prior, or I should say, just after the New Testament wraps up. And we'll open in a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to study church history tonight. Be with our study. I pray that it would be informative and helpful for each and every person that is here and those who will be watching online later. I do pray that our discussion would honor and glorify you, and that we would learn a great deal about where we came from and our own history. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So to begin with, you have to understand there was no plan B from the very beginning. There was one plan, no backup plan, which can stress a lot of people out, especially if you're a detail-oriented individual, thinking, okay, if this doesn't happen, what are the redundancies? What's the next step? And so all of this comes to a head when Jesus Christ instructs his disciples to go and find a room that they could celebrate the Passover. And so they did. They found a room. And they arrived in that room and got everything ready. And the evening did not go as planned. After they spent night in the upper room, Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. He gave them the Holy Spirit, breathed upon them, and began to talk as if everything was over simultaneously, that everything was just beginning. And Jesus Christ, the light that came into the world, was essentially passing his light on to the disciples. He knew that the light came into the world for the sole purpose of being extinguished. This would be what would save the souls of man. But when Christ would be extinguished, the revelation from the Father, of the Father, and the gospel itself would be passed into the hands of a few fishermen, a tax collector, some farmers, a zealot, and a few women. There was no plan B. There was no plan B. And so when we read the book of Acts, the tension is very high because Jesus is gone, and now all you have left is this message in the hands of these side characters during the story of Jesus. And these side characters get thrust to become the main characters. And now it's their job, with the power of the Holy Spirit, to spread the kingdom. And so they did. They tried the best. And through the power of God, he did great things. So after they took the gospel message, they passed it on to those who they discipled. If you were to ask the disciples of Jesus Christ when Jesus was coming back, they would say, oh, very soon. If you were to ask Paul, especially early in his ministry, when was Christ coming back? I mean, when he writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, it's very clear that the Apostle Paul believed it would be imminent at any moment. Paul himself would probably not live out his full life. And so the message of the gospel being in the hands of the apostolic leadership made a lot of sense until the apostolic leadership began to die out. And they began to grow old, and they genuinely came to the realization that perhaps Christ's plan is to come back, but down the road. And so they began to put all of their efforts into leading their converts to becoming the next generation of disciples. And there was no plan B. If Jesus had not passed the message to the disciples, and the disciples had not passed the message to the next disciples, and so forth and following, there would be no church. And so what we arrive at today at 64 AD all the way through 300 AD, we're covering the early apostolic era where the church is delicate. It can die quickly. It can fall away and fall apart, but it doesn't. It thrives. And this delicacy of this newfound fulfillment of the Jewish religion, what many referred to as a cult of the day, it could have died out easily. And so that is exactly what our enemy thought it would do. Satan would smash it out if he could, and so came the persecutions. Last week, we talked about the setting of Christianity and it being threefold, and all three important to grasp as we begin, and that is the Greek culture in which was established, the Greek language surrounding the entire Greek Empire, the Greek mindset, the Greek art, the Greek city-state, the entire culture itself presented a great opportunity for Christianity to come. Also, the Jewish people, and we talked a lot about their perspective and the books of the Bible that were given to us based upon their dedication to bring us the inspired Word of God, and then the Roman world, all of that by way of review last week. We left off saying the Roman world was immense for the ancient world. Even today, there are empires that don't span the globe like this, but the Roman world did. And now we arrive in our notes today, and we pick up with the Roman Empire and the persecution of the Jesus people. In 64 AD, a great fire sweeps through Rome. No one historically knows exactly how it started, though it's assumed and presumed by some that Nero himself started the fire. And fiddled well the city burned is the story. But did Nero set the fire? We don't know. We do know it was Nero who was responsible, ultimately, as the emperor. And as the emperor, had a responsibility to answer for the fire and quickly shifted blame to the Christians for the start of the fire. Now, why the Christians? Why was he so reticent to blame the Christians for this and begin the persecution? By the way, this is the same persecution in which Peter, who is also in Rome at the time, is taken captive and led away. It's the same persecution, Nero's, that Paul himself is taken captive and led away. Paul eventually to die, and Peter to be crucified, and not crucified as his Lord, but crucified upside down because he was unworthy to die in the same way as his Lord, he said. It was during this persecution that the early church truly began to understand what it was like not to be persecuted just by religious rivals, the Jewish leadership, but by Rome itself. And to understand the Roman persecutions of the Jewish and Christian people, it's important to understand the why behind it. Now, before I do that, why was it that we call it the Christian persecutions, but also sometimes you'll hear it referred to in history as the Jewish and Christian persecutions? Well, this is because during the first 200 years of the Christian church, it was synonymous to think of Jews and Christians being the same. Remember, Christianity, to the most of the world, was simply a sect of Judaism. It was a branch of Judaism. And Judaism had other branches, and now this new branch, Christianity. And the Jews who were Christians and the Jews who were not Christians often did not get along for obvious reasons. The most obvious of which is that Christians, after they become Christ followers and followers of Jesus, whether they're Jew or Gentile, become very loud with their beliefs. Part of our beliefs is to tell others about our beliefs. The very last thing our Messiah told us was go into all the world and tell everybody you can possibly find all about me. And so when Jew or Gentile received Jesus Christ as Savior, they began to tell everybody about it. Well, this did not go so well in the Roman cities. It's called proselytizing. We as Christians call it evangelizing, and the Jewish people did not do this, nor do they do much of this to this day. And as they began to tell everybody about Jesus, it started stirring up conflict in the cities. And so when the authorities came in and said, "Who's proselytizing and tell everybody not to worship the Roman gods?" Everybody pointed at the Christians, and lumped in with the Christians were the who? Jews. And so we call it the Christian-Jewish persecution because our early evangelistic efforts, from their perspective, the early proselytizing that the Christian church did, got the Jews in a lot of trouble, the Jewish people in a lot of trouble during that time. And nonetheless, why? Why were they so upset? Were the Romans so very committed to their gods that they just could not allow or tolerate any other belief system? Were they so irritated by the Christians who went around proselytizing that they just couldn't handle them knocking on their door anymore, so they said, kill them all? And the answer to that question is no. There was a real reason behind it, and the Roman historian Tacitus sums it up nicely. He says, Christianity is a deadly superstition, deserving of hatred from all the human race. Now, this is a Roman historian, and he writes in the 2nd century, and he says that Christianity is a deadly superstition. Why does he call it that? And and all Christians are deserving of hatred from every other human. Why would he say this? It's because of the mindset of a Roman. See, Romans went through a lot of rituals, and the rituals were there to keep them safe. The rituals were to worship the gods, and they would go and they would make sacrifices before their multitudes of different gods. And so let's say you wanted to have a child, you would go and you would sacrifice to Juno or Venus, Aphrodite, the Greek goddess, and you would sacrifice so that you would have children. But if you didn't have children, something was wrong with you. And the gods were upset with you. So something's wrong. And so you would sacrifice. And if you sacrificed and you still didn't get pregnant, then you know something's really bad. And let's say you wanted to have peace, but suddenly you found out there were wars taking place over in the Germanic tribes or way out in Gaul. And all of a sudden, your son was being taken and thrown into the army, and now he's, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stadia away from you. You don't know where he is anymore, and you think, why are we at war? And the answer is, you went down and you sacrificed to Mars, the god, and you sacrificed to him, and everybody else was sacrificing to him, but we still have war, and we're losing these wars. Who is it that might not be doing their part? If we were all united and we were all able to, in a unified voice, all come out and worship and sacrifice to the god Mars, then we would win. And all of our women are not bearing children, and it could be that we're sacrificing, but there's a lot of people who are no longer sacrificing to Venus. Not only that, the famines. The harvest isn't coming in. Ceres demands that if we don't sacrifice every single harvest to him, then the harvest of the next year is going to be decreased. And so I know I sacrificed, and I saw you, my neighbors, sacrifice, but I didn't see you sacrifice last year. Don't you sacrifice to Ceres? Do you sacrifice to Apollo? Do you sacrifice to Juno? And then the plagues come. So let me ask you what happened as an audience. How many of you remember anything interesting taking place in our society in the year of 2020? 2020. Anything take place? Does your mind go to anything specific? Shout it out. What took place in COVID? We used to call it coronavirus. Then we were educated as COVID, and it's COVID with the number 19. And then there's COVID, Omicron and B variant and Snickers. I don't know, lots of different And when it happened, it was terrible. It was terrible. What did everybody want to do immediately? What did everyone in this room do, including me? Correct. Buy toilet paper. Find somebody to blame. Now, I'm not making an argument here that was a wrong thing to do. And I'm not even making an argument that your opinion of who to blame is the wrong opinion. I'm saying everybody, when something like COVID happens, everybody needs to find somebody to blame. What happens when the market crashes? Not ups and downs, but crashes. And bankers are jumping out of skyscrapers. What are we doing? What do? You find somebody to blame. What happens when we go to war? Or we're attacked because we did not go to war? And our children and our grandchildren are being sent to fight a war in some far-off place. Or even worse, the war is encroaching upon us. What do? What is the most human reaction? What do? We find somebody to blame. So the Romans were no different. And when the world of Rome began to fall apart, and they began to say, we better sacrifice more to the gods, they looked around, and a lot of their neighbors were no longer sacrificing to the gods. So when things went badly, it was easy to blame the Christians for not praying to the gods. It's like the famous historian once said, when the Tigris River floods or the Nile River doesn't, the Christians to the lions. When the Tigris River floods or the Nile doesn't, the Christians to the lions. And so this is the reason why. And this is how it began. Now, Pliny the Younger is a Roman lawyer, and he writes of the 3 types of sentences under Christian persecution. 3 types of sentences that take place, and you can check the records. I'm trying to quote as many non-Christian historians as possible so that we can validate our history based upon the secular historians of the day. But Pliny the Younger, he writes there were 3 types of individuals: those who denied ever being Christian, those who apostatized, and Christians who remained steadfast. There were 3 kinds. So many Christians were brought into court. They didn't just go take them a sword and kill them in the street. They were prosecuted. This was a civilization with courts and judges. So what did they do? They bring them in, and those who deny, there were groups of people that say, I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Christian at all. My neighbor turned me in, and the reason they turned me in is because we have a problem with our HOA. They hate me since the last, they're just blaming me for being a Christian. I've never been a Christian, don't know Jesus, I'm not a Christian. So Pliny the Younger says, number 1, there are those who never were Christian. Number 2, those who changed their mind. They became apostates. They say, I was a Christian, but I'm done. I recant. I'm out. I see what this is, and I got involved in a scam, and it was a pyramid scheme, and it's a problem, and I'm out. I don't want anything to do with him. And then there were the 3rd kind, Christians who remained steadfast. Those who denied being Christian were supposed to pray to the gods and bow before the emperor. That's all you had to do. That's the way are you sure you're not? I've never been a Christian. Okay, here's sacrifice. And they would give them sacrifices, and they could go sacrifice to the gods, and then they bow before the emperor, an image of the emperor, and then they would leave. Like, that's simple. Like, think about this. Think about genuinely, you're not a Christian, and we live in a different society, and all you have to do, you have to miss work, you have to leave at lunch, you tell your boss you got to go downtown because you got a court case, It's not about a parking ticket. You got to go down there, and they're like, "Are you a Christian?" You're like, "No, I've never been a Christian." They're like, "Okay, all you have to do is throw this meat on the altar, burn it, and then go over and just kneel real quick, kneel before a painting of whatever politician you like, and then you're done. And you're back at work at 3:00. And all you're doing is complaining. I can't believe they made me do that. What a waste of time." All right? That's what they were doing. Then there were those who turned their back on Christ. They became apostates. They were told that they needed to curse Christ, pray to the Roman gods, and bow before the emperor. So they added, "You have to curse Christ." And there were many who did. And then there were those who remained steadfast. Execution was demanded. They had to die. If they were a Roman citizen, they were sent to Rome for imprisonment. In extreme cases, even they were executed, but they would have been executed in a more humane way, like a swift beheading. When I say more humane way, you have to understand how Nero persecuted Christians. Nero was nasty. He was nasty. Nero had a courtyard outside of his palace where he lit it up at night by dipping Christians in oil and wax, nailing them to spikes 10 feet above the ground, and lighting them on fire. Obviously, the individual would die within a matter of time, but they would remain burning because they were surrounded with wax like a candle. This is how. So much to say about Nero. I don't have time. This would cause a problem later. And the reason it would cause a problem is for the next 250 years, Christian persecution in the Roman Empire would expand and then wane and get really bad and then go away for a little bit. It came in waves. Don't believe, by the way, that for 250 years it was like solid persecution. Christians were hiding under the bench all the time. That wasn't the case. It really wasn't. There were vast decades where Christian persecution as a whole did not happen in the Roman Empire. It would just be regional. In the land of Smyrna, this was going on, or in the city of Corinth, this was going on. Different cities would ramp up persecution. There were only a few that were really empire-wide persecutions. Marcus Aurelius is famously one of the worst. Diocletian later on, famously one of the worst as well. But during this time, as those persecutions raged for 250 years, there were those who apostatized, but there were also those who died. Now, imagine you lived through that persecution. Okay? You're like a Holocaust survivor in their era. See, I say that with great amount of respect. And now, as you've lived through that, the church is starting to reconvene, and now we're free post the Edict of Milan. We're free now to worship Jesus Christ. And all of a sudden, the little church that we had now becomes free, and all of a sudden, we start seeing a lot more people come to church. And some of the people that start coming into church were those who apostatized. And so one of the early church splits, one of the early church schisms that takes place after Constantine, after Christianity becomes legal, is churches split over some people saying, "No, my grandfather died, and all you did was deny Christ and curse him. Get out." And the other half of the church was like, "No, Christ has forgiven me of everything. We need to forgive them and let them be part of the church." Huge, huge issue. That starts right here. 3 Christian responses. Let's talk about the 3 apostolic fathers. It's important if you're going to study early church history that you begin and understand who the early church fathers were. They are your spiritual forefathers. In the same way, Peter, James, John, Mary, and Martha are your spiritual forefathers and mothers. So these three are your spiritual forefathers. They're just the next generation. Right? Everybody knows who George Washington is, John Adams, right? Thomas Jefferson. And then we're like, and a guy named Quincy? I don't know. What's the next, right? And some of you have them all memorized. The three apostolic fathers are the ones who came after. Their names are Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna. All very important people. One of the reasons they're very important is because they're leading in these important cities. I know this one's hard to see, but can you see the Mediterranean Sea here? You see the Mediterranean? Okay. There are 5 important churches that we're going to know this week and next week. And the 5 most important churches to keep an eye on are Constantinople, or Byzantine, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Rome. Ephesus was very important during the 1st and middle of the 2nd century, but by the 3rd century, these were the main 5 churches. Incredibly important. We're going to go back to them constantly. So who took the church over after Peter in the city of Rome? The answer to that is a man named Clement of Rome. He is a disciple of Peter. Peter personally disciples him and installs him as the new pastor of Rome. And he dies in AD 101. So this is 100 years after the birth of Christ at this point. This is 70 years after the death of Christ. This is 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. This is right at the same time that John the Apostle is getting the book of Revelation. He is the pastor at the church at Rome. And as the pastor, he's most famous for writing a early church letter. This is an epistle that is not found in our Bible, but is a historically accurate epistle. It's a letter to Corinth. Remember 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians? This is another Corinthians. Guess what he writes them about? They're fighting in the church again. And he writes them a letter. Now, why is this important, and why am I telling you this? The reason Clement's writing is important is because in his letter to the Corinthians and several subsequent letters to the Corinthians and others, you begin to find out what the early church did and how it often met. In the New Testament, we only get so much information as it relates to what church services look like. In these writings, the early church fathers, we begin to find out more about the daily life and the worship practices of early Christians. And this is where we find out that early Christians are worshiping every single week. And when do they worship every single week? When do they worship? On Sunday. This is vastly found throughout all of the letters of the early church fathers. Not only that, but they're quoting. What do you think they quote a great deal in their letters and in their writings? Men like Clement of Rome. What do you think they're quoting in their letters? What do you think? Yeah? Anybody know what Christians might quote? The Bible? Yeah. So they're quoting the Old Testament, of course, but they start quoting the New Testament extensively. So this is fascinating and interesting. Men like Clement of Rome knew Peter, but he's quoting Peter's letters as if they are on equal standing and equal footing as Moses' writings. This is historically important. So when Polycarp and when Justin Martyr and when Ignatius are writing the churches, and they're quoting Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and they're quoting Paul's letter to the Colossians, and they're quoting James's general letter to the church, when they're quoting this, those quotes in all of their extensive writings become really important later on in another church council hundreds of years later. when the church is trying to establish what is the true canon of the early church. What are the trusted books of the Bible and which books are not trusted? Well, how do they know which books were trusted hundreds of years before they're talking about this? The answer is the early church fathers were quoting them quite often. Not only do you have Clement of Rome, but you also have Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius was a disciple of John and Peter, and he was appointed as pastor at Antioch by Peter. Primarily, Ignatius was a disciple of John, spent more time with the Apostle John. Remember, John is the one who writes the books of 1st and 2nd, 3rd John and Revelation and the Gospel of John. And as his disciple, Ignatius becomes the pastor there in Antioch. Antioch, remember, is a very important church, even in the book of Acts. Much of the powerhouse of the church had moved from Jerusalem up to Antioch. We see that where first Christians were first called Christians in Antioch. And he dies 10 years after Clement in 110 AD. When Ignatius died, this fresco shows you, when Ignatius died, he was, eaten by lions, as you can see here. Most of our early church fathers were killed in some way or another. To be a Christian, especially a leader of the time, meant this was most likely your end. It's quoted, his quote, whenever he was in the arena ready to die, his quote was, "May the wild beasts be eager to rush upon me. If they be unwilling, I compel them to do so. Come, crowds of wild beasts, come, tearing and mangling, racking of bones, hacking of limbs. Come, you cruel tortures of the devil, only let me attain unto Christ." The quotes that we receive from these individuals, many of them can be found in collected works of individuals like the Fox's Book of Martyrs, but these are not compilations of somebody's fantasy. These are eyewitness accounts that are collected by individuals like Fox who put them together. Let's move on to, we talked about Blandina the martyr. We don't have time tonight on Sunday. This last Sunday, we talked about her a bit. Let's talk about Polycarp. Polycarp was of Smyrna. How do we know the name Smyrna in the Bible, the city of Smyrna? Where do we know that name from? In the book of Revelation, right? And one of the 7 churches that John writes to, or that John writes to on behalf of Jesus, is the city of Smyrna. And Polycarp becomes the pastor there. Again, he also is a disciple of John. As an old man, John disciples a young Polycarp. Now, Polycarp probably in his 20s, the same way John was in his 20s when Jesus discipled him. And Polycarp becomes an amazing early church father. And he's appointed, as I said, to the pastorate there. He dies in 156 AD, so 50 years after Clement. His story is really interesting because when he dies, he's taken and thrown into the arena, and the crowds begin to shout at him. It's said they started shouting at him, "Away with the atheists! Away with the atheists!" They called Christians atheists. Why do you think they called Christians atheists? Because they didn't believe in gods. Anybody who didn't believe in their gods, were atheists without God. Away with the atheists, they called. Away with the atheists. The proconsul asked him to revile Christ, and he would be released. All you have to do is curse Christ, and you'll be fine. To which he pointed at the crowd and cried, 86 years have I served Jesus, and he has never done me wrong. How then can I blaspheme him, my king, who has saved me? I am a Christian. As they shouted, away with the atheist, away with the atheist, Polycarp looks up in the crowd and points at them and says, away with the atheists, away with the atheists. They began to tie him to a stake to be burned. but he requested that he not be tied. He said, the same Christ who has given me power to stand before you today, an 86-year-old man, mind you, he said, the same power that Christ has given me to stand before you will give me power to stay within the flame. And there he stood, holding on to the stake, not tied to it, as the flames surrounded him and they ate him alive. These are the early church fathers. I obviously don't have time to speak of all of them. There's a collection. But these are referred to as the three apostolic church fathers. Let's talk about heresies, schisms, and apologists. What is a heresy? Heresy is a false doctrine that tries to creep into the church. Well, Paul tried to warn us this would take place, did he not? Christ himself said that wolves would come into the flock. And so these false teachings begin to enter the church, but the church fights against these heresies. What are schisms? What are schisms? Schisms are not the same as heresies. Schisms are splits within the church. Sometimes a church will go through a split where the church itself, something unhealthy is there, and the church splits, and sometimes it ends up becoming two churches, and God's like, that'll work. Right? But the church itself, not just local individual churches split, but the church itself as a whole, the family of God will split and create new branches. Schisms. We're going to talk about many of those schisms over the next 7 or 8 weeks. The schisms that create the denominations that you can see to this day. And then what is an apologist? What is an apologist? You say, that's what my husband is after he does something dumb, right? An apologist is somebody who stands for a specific set of virtues, values, or belief systems. An apologist a Christian apologist is somebody who defends the Christian faith. One of the earliest Christian apologists was a man named Justin Martyr. You say, he must become a martyr, and that's where we got the term. Well, no, martyr actually means somebody who dies for their beliefs. But Justin, historically, his last name had been replaced with martyr because he dies so spectacularly. But so often his martyrdom is highlighted, but his work as an apologist is not. And the reason I bring it up at this point is because what takes place simultaneously is the devil starts sending false doctrine and heresies into the church in the forms of Marcionism and Gnosticism. And men like Justin Martyr, who were deep, incredible theologians, stood up and began to fight against these false doctrines. It takes a lot of guts to be an apologist. I love to study apologists. I don't consider myself an apologist. I consider myself a frontline pastor. That's what I do. But there have been apologists throughout church history. They spend their entire life defending core important doctrines against false teaching and heresies. And so we got to honor Justin Martyr. He was a Samaritan. And, Samaria, right? Down in the midst of between Galilee and Judea, he was a Samaritan who got saved. He becomes an apologist after studying the Old Testament works, and he wrote our very first Christian apologist writing called the Apology in 153, and he wasn't sorry for doing so, amen? All right, that's a joke. I love this. There's a lot of great quotes I had to delete for this, but I love this quote from Justin Martyr. He states in his Apology, "We used to hate and destroy one another and refuse to associate with people of another race or country. But now, because of Christ, we live together with such people and pray for our enemies." Part of his apology, part of being an apologist for the early apologists, it was not simply, I have a better argument to crush your argument. They relied on logic and rationale, yes, but they relied heavily upon life change and community turnaround. And as you can see in this quote, by the way, this is what Christ does. I'm going to break the TV. This is what Christ does. Christ changes people. And the more people he changes, those become changed communities. And the more communities are changed, those become changed villages. And the more villages are changed, those become changed cities. And the more cities that are changed, those become changed states. And the more states are changed, those become changed countries. This is how to change a country. And the more countries are changed, it changes the world. This is how it happens. This is how it works. While we had apologists, we also have men like Marcion. I'm going to say Marcion. You say, boo, Marcion. You don't even know. Why would you boo him? I could have. What's that? Oh, that's right. I told him he's a heretic. Yeah, he is. He's a heretic. How do you know he's a heretic? Well, because it says, hello, I'm a heretic. See, right there. He is a heretic. He's a Christian from Smyrna, but he did not stay in Smyrna. He actually moved to Constantinople and developed a new theology while there. He was building his fortune. He was not a minister at that time. He actually moved to Constantinople, became an extremely wealthy individual, and developed while he was there a new theology, a new philosophy, and began to infiltrate the Christian church with his great wealth and with his great ability to speak with this theology. He eventually moved to Rome and became a huge thorn in the side of the true Christian pastors like myself. Don't laugh. I am a true Christian pastor. He's like, ha ha, that one's not a joke. Like I think I am. What was his bad theology? Marcionism, which will eventually affect Gnosticism and then eventually affect and truly influence Roman Catholicism in a lot of ways. And again, don't be offended by what I say, that I'm going to connect all of those dots historically. Marcion rejected the Old Testament as important to the church. That is not what all of his followers hundreds of years later would do. I'm saying he was a great influence, and his influence reigns into this day in a lot of ways. You'll see the connection when I connect him to Gnosticism and then Augustinianism. So his belief was that the Old Testament didn't matter at all, like at all. It had no relevance upon the Christian. By the way, that is a false doctrine that is re-emerging into the church today. That the Old Testament has no bearing. There's a very well-known, famous pastor in the South who talks about this. Very well-known and followed. And he talks about the fact that the Old Testament has no bearing on our faith as a Christian at this point at all. This is Marcionism. And it's re-emerging. It's very sad to see. Marcionism also taught that the New Testament only edited, he believed in the New Testament, but only in the Gospel of Luke. He did not trust Matthew, Mark, and John, and only an edited Gospel of Luke, one that he took out several things in. And he only believed in the 10 Pauline epistles, minus the pastoral epistles. So for his New Testament, for his Bible, Marcion only believed in the Gospel of Luke and 10 of the letters that Paul wrote. That was it. From that, he concluded that there are two gods, not one, two gods. God creator and God redeemer. God creator God, and Father God, right? And the reason is because he could not, in his mind, get beyond this God of the Old Testament seems drastically different than the God of Paul and Luke. So for him, he just couldn't get past that. So he concluded there were two gods, God, creator God, and Father God. Does everybody have notes? By the way, you follow along. All these are in your notes as well. He also believed and taught that law and judgment belongs to creator God, while redemption belongs to Father God. He believed in Jesus, but he believed that Jesus only spiritually rose from the dead. Jesus died upon the cross, was buried, but he never physically rose from the dead. This is a false teaching that continues through modern liberal churches to this day, through German rationalism that rose up in the late 1800s, in the 19th century, that has spread throughout liberal theologians today, that Jesus rose from the grave, but he rose from the grave like spiritually speaking. He's alive in our memories, kind of like Mufasa up in the cloud. We remember him, right? But the Bible is very clear on this point. Jesus physically rose from the grave. Well, I mean, Marcion did not believe so. He also believed that Paul was the only true apostle. That was he liked Paul so much. That was the only one for him. He also believed in asceticism. Asceticism was emphasized. Asceticism is the idea of self-denial to an extreme. So as Christians, we believe in fasting, but we have purposes for our fasting. Asceticism is the idea of self-hurt, self-harm, even to the point of self-flagellation. Hurting yourself. And you see the connections now into Gnosticism, which we'll talk about, Augustinianism, and then eventually Romanism. And so for him, in his belief system, there was no sex, not even among married couples. It was sinful. It was an evil necessity for the procreation of children. No meat and milk, for they are products of creatures who had sex. Only fish. I don't know what he thought happened there, but Marcion wasn't a scientist, per se. And only unmarried people could be baptized. You say, well, when did other people get to be baptized? After their death. When they died, they could be somebody could baptize them for the dead. So this was asceticism. Marcion would highly influence Augustine, and then eventually, as I said, Romanism. Polycarp, by the way, knew Marcion. They knew each other. They had been friends in Smyrna. And Polycarp one time was visiting in Rome. Remember, Polycarp, hero. Polycarp, yay, Polycarp. Marcion, right. When Polycarp was visiting Rome, he happened upon Marcion in a marketplace. And he ignored him. Polycarp would not acknowledge him. And Marcion walked up to Polycarp and said, "Don't you know me anymore, Polycarp?" And Polycarp replied, "Yes, I know you. You were the firstborn son of Satan." Yeah, ancient burn. So there he is. Hello, I'm a heretic. Son of Satan. Gnosticism. We'll brief it because we're going to talk a bit about it next week. Gnosticism. Gnosticism was the most significant heresy that entered the church. You still see Gnosticism today cropping up all over the place, even in Baptist churches, even in Christian churches, even in Bible churches. It rises up and you're going to see it. Gnosticism believes that there are those that are capable of attaining a deeper knowledge about God than anyone else. They have a deeper knowledge. They don't need to just read the Bible. They read between the lines. There's a code between the letters. If you circle this letter and then the seventh letter and then another seventh letter and then another letter, and you're going to see it's going to say, "Don't trust Hitler," right? This is the kind of stuff, right? Gnostics were very mystics, very much into mysticism. They believed in deeper knowledge. Even the artwork of Gnosticism shows this, right? He's leaving the natural realm, what most can see, and he's peering behind the curtain. He can see what nobody else can see. That's the essence of Gnosticism. A deeper knowledge of origin and essence and destiny of spiritual nature of human beings. When I say spiritual nature of human beings, they hated anything as it relates to the flesh. Anything physical or fleshly, anything that was good, physically speaking, was actually evil. In fact, they state that the material world is essentially evil, a result of the fall, all of it. So because of the fall, Adam and Eve sinned, and they partook of that fruit, and for them it wasn't a physical fruit. For them, original sin was Adam and Eve enjoying the gift of each other. This fall results in the material, physical world that we have. And so everything you see, it's evil. Your body is evil. And because not just the the table and the chairs and the building is evil. Your body is evil. You should hate your flesh. And anything that's good for it or nourishes it, I should say. The Creator God, by the way, is one of the, by the way, with that concept, I just got to stop and say this. That's why sometimes you see, even in Christian circles today, people talking about, sometimes, I don't know if you've ever heard, like, this kind of crazy thing. Yeah, I just fight my flesh all the time. I like to get in the shower and just turn on the cold water and say, take that, flesh, this kind of stuff. It's not ancient Gnosticism. Or have you ever heard somebody say, that music, it's too, I don't know, that music, it's too fleshly. It makes my body it just makes my body move, right? I like music that makes me fall asleep. We need worship music that makes you hate being there. Because if it's fleshly, if it feels at all, then it's wicked. Because anything the flesh enjoys is bad. Gnosticism. He believed the Creator God's Gnosticism taught that the Creator God was one of many lesser deities in the universe, that Jesus was sent by the Creator God to give us a deeper knowledge. Jesus was not a physical man, by the way. He was just God, a spirit. He was not man. This is very important next week when we talk, because the early church was convinced. Some of them were convinced that Jesus was not God. He was just a man. Some of them were convinced that Jesus was only God, one of many gods, and not a man. So there was this fight. Some believed he was all God. Some believed he was all man. But the scripture teaches differently. And we're going to see that addressed in one of the church councils next week. So this gave rise to the need for Gnostic literature. And so because there were a huge new group of quote-unquote Christians who believed things that the Bible did not teach, they needed to write their own Bibles. And so they started writing all sorts of new gospel according to Judas, and the gospel according to Mary Magdalene, and the gospel according to Thomas. And 2,000 years later, a guy named Dan Brown is like, I found a new gospel. And it's like, no, you didn't. It's been around for a while. And some dude's like, watch the Da Vinci Code. Jesus was married. No, like this was it. It's not relevant. That'll rise us in preparation for next week. I'll briefly talk about Constantine, and then I'll take questions. This will prep us for next week. This gives rise to Constantine I. He becomes the Roman emperor in 306. And he's coming in after Diocletian. Diocletian is one of the greatest persecutors of the church in human history. But for our purposes, it's important to understand that Diocletian also split the Roman Empire into two parts, the Western and the Eastern Empire. Rome would remain the capital of the Western Empire, and Constantinople would become the capital of the Eastern Empire. Political turmoil is taking place, and I don't have time to talk about that, but you have some notes there. You can look it up. I'm sorry. So there's this split. There's a fight that's about to take place, and this is what I will say. There's a man named Constantine who is also rival for the empire, and he's trying to fight for it. And because of this split, the East versus the West, Constantine has to take it to the battlefield, and he does. And so they arrive on the battlefield, ready to fight, and in October 28th, 312 A.D., something very significant happens in Christian history. The emperor has a dream the night before he goes to battle at the Milvian Bridge. He's about to face his political opponent. He's about to face his rival. And the night before, he lays down and he falls asleep. And this is a famous fresco that is found in France that demonstrates this. Goes back to the 9th century. As he's sleeping there, he has a dream. And the dream, this is the other part of the fresco, is that as he's about to cross the bridge, he's going to see a sign in the sky. The emperor will see this sign, and it'll be the sign of the cross. And above the cross, it will be written in Latin, "With this sign, conquer." So this emperor believes that the way he's going to move forward is to follow the sign of the cross. Now, it's debated whether or not he saw a cross like we would have in a modern church. The ancient crosses were more of an X on its side, or the Chi-Rho, which was the most significant symbol for Christians during that era. Chi-Rho representing the name of Jesus Christ in Greek. And so nonetheless, whatever sign it was, he takes that sign and he wins at the Battle of the Bridge. And when he does win at the Battle of the Bridge, he is utterly convinced that his victory, at least the story goes, he's utterly convinced that his victory is due to this Christian God. And so because this victory is dedicated to the Christian God, it was less than a year later he establishes the Edict of Milan, where in Milan itself, Christianity is legalized in AD 313. So after 250 years of Christian persecutions, we see Christianity is made legal by Constantine. Now, the question is, did Constantine really become a Christian? Or did he use, was it a political advantage to use Christianity? Many historians will say that Christianity had so spread in the Roman Empire at this point, they had become a very, very major sub-base to win. And so it was definitely politically astute whether or not Constantine was a true convert. It is noteworthy, however, that Constantine did not actually get baptized until his deathbed some 40 years later. So I question whether or not he was a true believer. But I often question politicians, actually. He also then moved the capital of the empire to Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople. By the way, that city is still around. Today it's referred to as, does anybody know? Istanbul. It is an ancient city and renamed many times. This all leads us to the Council of Nicaea that takes place only 12 years later. It's the first church council to take place legally, at least by the laws of men. And it is at this church council that they are fighting over what? The deity of Jesus Christ. And that leads to next week, where we're going to talk about the four major Christological councils, the four first church councils that take us through 300 AD, or AD 300 all the way to AD 500, and the rise of the modern church.